Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Sarah Brown, and I am the Executive Director of Chhange, the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education, proudly housed at Brookdale Community College. Harnessing the power of innovative education to promote a better society is at the heart of our work at Chhange. Since its establishment in 1979, Chhange has carried out its mission to educate about the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights, promote the elimination of racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of prejudice, and develop creative models regarding these crucial human issues. Now, today we're extremely proud because we are marking another moment of innovation in Chhange's lengthy, now more than 42-year history. Today we are launching our digital archives. This is a moment of great pride and joy for us as we are able to create this virtual platform, which will make available to educators, learners, and the general public so many wonderful, priceless, just deeply meaningful artifacts that we have in Chhange's archives. Now, just a little bit about how these archives came about, and actually maybe first a little bit about how Chhange came about. Um, Chhange grew out of a faculty development program grant that was awarded to two professors at Brookdale Community College by the college, Professor Cy Siegler and Professor Jack Needle. And the two of them were exploring this idea of how do we teach the Holocaust? Why study the Holocaust? When they initially conceived of this idea, I think they expected that they would have a handful of supporters, many of their friends coming to just support them as they did this initial program. And in the end, it was so well attended that they went on to create what we now know of as Chhange. Now, from the beginning, the backbone of Chhange has been its survivor community. First as speakers, but also as volunteers, and also as contributors to this archives that we are going to be sharing with you today. Now, when Cy and Jack conceived of this idea of the center, they quickly turned to members of the community who had survived the Holocaust in order to help them make it a reality. They spoke to students, they spoke to the greater public. They were also amongst the first volunteers, including beloved Erica Rosenthal, whom Cy and Jack affectionately referred to as our iron-fisted office manager, but also Ruth Knoop, John Wolfe, and dozens of others. This original partnership with the volunteers who took ownership over the center continues even to this day, and we are so very excited to have our volunteers back with us at the center. Chhange's survivors were also the first contributors to the archives. To date, we have received donations from more than 200 individuals who brought in artwork, books, correspondence, diaries, clothing, memoirs, oral histories, photographs, personal documents, government documents, this rich treasure trove of historical and often priceless items that they wanted to give to Chhange with the intention of educating the generations to come. To date, we now have archival items donated by Holocaust survivors, survivors of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, and families of Armenian genocide survivors who also entrusted Chhange with the care and safekeeping of these valuables. These valuables are now so important to our community. They are an important part of our education and our advocacy efforts, and they will be able to tell the story, the human story of these horrible dark chapters of history long after many of their original owners have passed. These archival items remain of great value to our community, and our children and our tomorrow's children are now going to be able to be a part of this legacy. So today, without further ado, I'm very excited to launch Chhange's digital archives. I'm excited and grateful to all of the many people who have helped to make today a reality, including our beloved survivors, their families who have entrusted us with these items, Chhange staff and volunteers, and all of you who are joining us today to take part in this key and exciting moment. Now, first things first, one of the things that we have to do is show you how we get to the archives. How do you access our online collection? You go to the Chhange main page, And there you will see a tab for our new digital archives. Navigate to the tab and click on the button to access our online collections. Welcome to our official new digital archives. Here you are at the homepage for Chhange's Digital Archives. Here you will see our navigation menu. You will see that here, when you click on this, it brings you to this homepage. We have a keyword search function, an advanced search function, random images, archives, library, objects, photos, exhibits, and people. Now, one of the nice things about this homepage is that it explains what each of these are. So the first thing that you'll see is the keyword search. And this is a great space for you to do a general search according to a specific word or set of words that you want to search. But I do want to be mindful that if you put together a string of words, it will search for that phrase, but also each individual word. So be careful about what you type in there. You may end up getting an awful lot more, but that also can be a really fun way to discover and explore new topics and new items. We then have our advanced search, which allows you to be more specific with your search. So if you already know what it is that you're looking for, this is a great place to look. We have random images, which is another fun way to just click on something and see all kinds of new things as they're being added, or if you want to be surprised, this is like the surprise me bar. And then we also have up here archives, library, objects, photos, exhibits, and people. We'll get to those. First thing I want to do though is show you what the random images looks like. So here is just an option of just some random images if you're interested in just perusing some of the images that we have on file. Now, these images may take you to a book, it might take you to a document, it might take you to a photograph, it might take you to an archival object. That's the fun part about this, is it offers you a broad array, a diverse array of items from the collection. If you specifically are looking for photographs, it's a good idea to come here to photos and start searching through our photos. Now remember, we have images for many of the objects that are in the collection. Not all of them are photographs though. Here you have objects, and here you'll see specific objects, like for example, this baking pot, which was used by a person who was living in the displaced persons camps after World War II and the Holocaust. And then over here, we have our archive search. And here you can see one of the first things is a propaganda book titled Adolf Hitler, which details in German the life of Adolf Hitler and served as a piece of glorification. But there are many other objects and items that are here too. What we'd like to delve into now is actually a practicum where we will explore the collections and also use the collections in order to tell the story of a specific survivor of the Holocaust, Ruth Knoop. Ruth was someone that we mentioned just before as one of the early founding volunteers at Chhange. She was a librarian and an organizer extraordinaire, or so I am told. I did not have the fortune of getting to meet her. And she also, when it came time, she decided to donate many objects and items to the Chhange archives, and they have been incredible. It's been an incredible experience exploring them, getting to know them, and also learning more about Ruth's life through them. And so today we want to take you on that journey with us and select a few of those items to share with you a little bit about Ruth's life before, during, and also after the Holocaust. Let's get started. Ruth was born in 1922, and her family lived on a beautiful, they ran a hotel and a spa in a beautiful spa town called Bad Reinhardt in Germany. She was born to loving parents, and she had a sister, Elsa, who was about a year and a half older than Ruth. So the first place we want to take you is actually to have a look at an image. And here I'll show you how we're going to do the search of Ruth and her sister. So I'm going into photos, I'm putting in Ruth's name. And the first photo that pops up is this beautiful black and white photo of Ruth and her sister, Elsa. And here you can see Ruth is just 1 year old, sitting in this wicker chair. And Elsa, with the big, beautiful bow over her head, is 2.5 years old. Often when our younger learners interact with black and white photography and we ask them, what are some words that come to mind? They will say things like ancient, old, in the past, long ago, and that can create a little bit of disassociation and distance between them and the people depicted in the photograph. One of the things that I love about this image is how easy it is to relate to it. Asking the students who here has photographs with their siblings, who here at one point or another was dressed up for a family photograph, who here has a pose just like this, or wore a bow just like this, or wore a special dress or an outfit in order to be photographed for a family event. I think that that can foster a sense of connection with the actual image that they're interacting with here. And it's also a great launching point for telling a little bit of the story of Ruth and her happy childhood, growing up in a warm household with her mother, her father, and her grandmother, this warm environment that was filled with the arts. She came from a family that had many passions. Her father loved painting, her mother loved music, and the house was always filled with music. And also, because they ran this hotel, many guests during the summer. It was a festive time. It was a full time. There were many tourists who would come in. And then even in the winter, they had the occasional skier. So she had this full and rich childhood. Interestingly, it is worth noting that where they grew up, there was not a lot of Jewish education in the town. And so Ruth and her sister Elsa were sent next to a nearby neighboring town in order to attend Hebrew school once a week. So Ruth's childhood was altogether normal. And yes, she attended public school, and okay, there weren't that many Jewish children. I think Ruth and Elsa were the only Jewish children who attended school there, but they had many friends, and everything was going smoothly until Hitler came to power and tensions began to rise and everything changed in their community. There was rising anti-Semitism. The family faced boycotts of their hotel. They lost friends. They experienced some threats. So this became a time of rising tension for Ruth and her sister and her family members. And eventually, the parents made the very difficult decision to send them away to a nearby Jewish school. So just from this photograph, this beginning of Ruth's life, this depiction of an utterly normal setting, you can start to build out this richer story that doesn't begin Ruth's life story with the events of the Holocaust and the rise of Adolf Hitler. Instead, you're talking about an absolutely normal childhood that was disrupted, and that disruption of what would have been an otherwise normal life, that is a key part of the story of Ruth and her overall resilience. With rising tensions and fewer options, Ruth's parents eventually make the decision to encourage her to try to become a nurse. They weren't really certain what Ruth's future would be staying in their town. And so they sent her to the Jewish hospital in Berlin, where they were advertising a need for nurses. The problem was that Ruth was only 16 and a half, and she was actually too young in order to become a nurse, but they still accepted her because they were desperate for nurses, and they took her on as a student nurse. So Ruth goes to Berlin to become a student nurse, and her sister Elsa secures a job in an office. Now, here we would go back to our photos. We're going to search for Ruth again. And we're going to scroll down, and there you're going to see there are actually two photographs. Here is Ruth and her very dear friend Lotte, and they are in their student nursing uniforms. This is after she arrived in Berlin. She left for Berlin in April of 1939. And here, actually, you can see the photograph, but you can also see that we've inserted here some of Ruth's memories from this time. And you can see that she talks about when she began nursing school and how she became very good friends with Lotte, and then the uniforms that they wore. So here again, you see an image in black and white, but she describes it as a grayish blue dress with a white collar and a white apron. When you return to search results, you can scroll down further, and there you will see another photograph of the surgical staff, and this is after Ruth eventually becomes a surgical nurse. And here is an image of her. She is right here. And here is Dr. Hans Knoop, who is going to feature in this story as her love interest. And they are also accompanied by other nurses and surgeons. Now, here again, we insert some of Ruth's recollections. And she says, I completed my nurse's training at Berlin Jewish Hospital, and after a practicum year, I became a full-fledged nurse. We were given room and board in the hospital and earned a small salary. I now wore a white uniform and a nurse's pin. But then she also reflects on the rising tensions. This is a time of both achievement for her, but also rising tensions. The hospital became almost like a ghetto because there were only Jewish people there and the war was raging outside. But we were like a big family. Everyone knew each other. I became very friendly with a young, handsome surgeon by the name of Hans Knoop. And here, perhaps leaning a little bit awkwardly away from Ruth, if you want to make guesses about that, is Dr. Hans Knoop. At the same time as Ruth is studying to become a nurse in Berlin, her sister Elsa was working in an office. And here you can see I put in Elsa's name in the search, and I'm able to scroll down. There's more photographs of her and Ruth as children. Here's a beautiful photograph of her, Ruth, and also their mother, Ella. And here is another photograph of Ella, their mother, and then Elsa, and a young man named Lothar. And here again, we turn to Ruth's recollections. And she describes how her sister, working in an office, met, fell in love with, and married a young man named Lothar. Unfortunately, their love story has a more tragic ending than Ruth's love story with Hans Knoop. They decided to try to get to Palestine by ship and escape Nazi Germany, and traveled at first to Vienna, Austria, and then on to Budapest, Hungary, and they got as far as Yugoslavia before they were stranded there in the winter months. Unfortunately, that was the last time that Ruth ever heard from her sister. And here she actually notes that for more than 50 years, I mistakenly believed she survived the war and we would someday find each other. Later, she learned what had happened. Lothar was shot by the Nazis in October 1941, and Elsa was murdered in a gas wagon in 1942 in Yugoslavia. As we return to Ruth's story and the rising tensions in Berlin and her experiences, we would go back to objects, and here we would type in her name again. And the first image that is going to come up is a textile patch of the Jewish yellow star that Ruth was forced to wear by the Germans. This requirement, issued in September of 1941, was a requirement that she often decided not to obey. And so here again, we get to tell the story of Ruth's bravery, resistance, and even rather close calls. Because as she describes it, they were forced to wear this yellow star on their outer garment and also on their nursing garb. And she contrived a way with pins in order to be able to remove it whenever she left the hospital grounds. And she would do this in order to go out, to go get her hair done, to go to the cinema, to enjoy a bottle of wine with her friends at Hitler's favorite restaurant, the Hotel Adlon. Now, Ruth almost gave herself away in that hotel when they ordered lunch and their bottle of wine, because they mistakenly ordered meat, and it was a Friday. And Fridays at that time, on Fridays, the Christian church forbade people from eating meat. They were to abstain from meat. And here she was ordering it. And the waiter, thankfully, believe that she misunderstood that it was Friday. She thought it must have been another day, and it was a foolish mistake on her part, and he did not suspect her. The risks were very high, though. If she had been caught, especially in Adolf Hitler's favorite restaurant, not wearing her star, defying all of the bans and ordinances that had been issued against Jews by that time, it almost meant certain deportation to Auschwitz. In fact, a friend of hers who had boarded a train or a trolley not wearing her star unintentionally paid the wrong fare, and as punishment, she was deported straight to Auschwitz and murdered. These close calls did nothing to deter her, though. She had this great sense of resistance and a sense of independence, and rejected these requirements issued by the Germans to identify herself publicly, and thereby further restrict her access and her ability to move around the city as she pleased. As tensions continued to rise, Ruth described the Gestapo as constant visitors at the hospital, and they were always looking for people hiding and rounding up and deporting staff and patients. One of the people who provided false papers during this time to Jewish patients was Dr. Chhange Knoop, and she often would aid him in various ways. Chhange had both Jewish and non-Jewish relatives, and he was able to be hidden by his non-Jewish relatives if necessary. At one point, sorry, one second. Eventually, the restrictions continued, and it became impossible to leave the hospital without a special permit. People expected that they would be deported at any time, and eventually Ruth heard of the Theresienstadt concentration camp in Czechoslovakia and also heard of Auschwitz. They understood these to be work camps. In July of 1943, Ruth received a note from her mother written quite hastily in red pencil. And this note we do not have in our archives because actually Ruth asked to be buried with it, as it was the last note that she ever received from her mother. To access the content about the note, though, we will put in a search for the name she used for her mother, Mutti. Here we have a portrait of Ruth's mother, Ella, and we also have Ruth's recollections in her own words about when she received the note from her mother. It read, "Dearest good Ruth, Wednesday, 9 o'clock in the evening, we will all be picked up. Too bad you cannot help us. Do not forget me. With God for you and Elsa, many heartfelt regards and kisses, Mutti." This is the last note that Ruth ever received from her mother. And so while we have a photograph of that note in our exhibit, Journeys Beyond Genocide, The Human Experience, we do not have the actual note in our archives because, as I noted, Ruth asked that she be buried with it. In August of 1943, Ruth's name appeared on a list for deportation, and she was picked up by a truck from the hospital, and she was deported to Theresienstadt concentration camp. She was separated from her belongings. She was herded into a large room. She slept on a disgusting mat on the floor and waited until a bunk became available that she could sleep on. At the time, she was constantly hungry, and they were deliberately starving the inmates there. For the first few months at Theresienstadt, Ruth suffered terribly and worked a variety of odd jobs, was starving constantly, and eventually became quite ill. And it was only after she went to the sick barracks that they realized that she was trained as a nurse, and she began working in what she referred to as the so-called hospital. Ruth credits her nursing training as helping in her survival, as most of the workers that were there were not trained, and they very much needed competent nurses and valued her as a result. And Ruth was there when the Red Cross visited Theresienstadt and recalls that the Germans quickly turned it into what they called a model camp, beautified the grounds, and dressed the children well in order to show how well the Germans were treating the Jews. Unfortunately, though, as soon as the Red Cross left, deportations began again to Auschwitz, and most of the children who had been on display for that visit were sent to and murdered at Auschwitz. It is interesting to note that while at Theresienstadt, many public services continued to function, including the post office. And here we're going to go to keyword search. We are going to type in postcard. And the first thing that comes up are postcards that Ruth was able to receive while she was interned in Theresienstadt camp. It's interesting to note that this postal service actually extended to other camps as well, and that it became a key way for people imprisoned in the camp to communicate with those outside of the camp, often using coded messages and coded words, because of course these interactions, these communications were closely watched by the Germans and their subordinates, and they were heavily censored. So here we actually have an example of one translated letter that was sent to Ruth by her good friends, the Shapskys. They were like parents to her when she was at the Berlin Jewish Hospital. And here is a note that they sent to her, translated into English. My beloved child, again, a greeting from you. We are happy with every signature. In only 3 words, you told us of your love and devotion. How happy you made me. We are well and our thoughts are with you always. My nephew is fine. Bubby is supposed to be so-so. Puppy wrote, the letter is from July. Can you imagine how long the mail takes? She sounds happy and still works as a teacher. Lotta is a darling. I can't tell you how much she worries about you. And Annalise is unchanged. You were right about her. Please give our best to all our friends there. And you, my girl, be brave. We love you so much. Lots of love and kisses. Paps and Mammy. Looking at these postcards is a really great opportunity to talk to your students about this idea that the postal service was working in an otherwise unreal, surreal, horrific situation like Theresienstadt. They also had money. There was currency that was designed actually by someone and printed by the bank in Prague. And there was a currency specifically for Theresienstadt. I think that these are really interesting entry points for a conversation about what life must have been like for those who were interned there and trying to live a normal existence in otherwise completely abnormal circumstances. Moving right along to life after the Holocaust and Ruth's efforts to rebuild and recreate her life. While she was imprisoned at Theresienstadt, Ruth worked very hard, and she felt that working hard kept her from having to think too much about her circumstances. And she extended her skills and her abilities, but also her natural compassion and care to benefit the people who were suffering around her. Eventually, she was part of a transport that was facilitated by the Swedish Red Cross in order to remove all of the Danish Jews who were interned at Theresienstadt. So she joined those Danish Jews when they were bussed out, and in total, about 400 people were able to leave on these buses to Denmark. And with that, Ruth was free. The journey was a harrowing one. They had to travel for several days across a war-torn and decimated Germany. They had to hide amongst trees in order to look out for bombings. They had a very difficult travel, and eventually they arrived in Sweden. Now, when the war ended and the Holocaust was over, Ruth was incredibly happy. She was overjoyed. She was relieved. But at the same time, she realized that she began to think of her family and their fate. She was now 23 years old, and she realized that she was alone. She eventually learned that her parents had been murdered in Auschwitz, and while she, as we noted earlier, held on to hope that perhaps her sister had survived, it does appear that no one in her family survived. Now, at this time, Ruth was staying with a Danish family, and they took her in and treated her very well. But she was considering going back to Germany to look for her love, Dr. Hans Knoop. He had gone into hiding and she was not sure of his fate and wanted to go back to look for him, but did not have the right paperwork. And times were so uncertain, and there was an awful lot of chaos in Germany. And so her Danish adoptive parents encouraged her not to go. They were worried for her and afraid that if she left, she would not be allowed back into Denmark. So instead, she traveled on to Stockholm, Sweden, and there began nursing again. Now, eventually, Ruth became a large group that emigrated to the United States, and she arrived in the US in October of 1949. And Ruth's goal was to become a registered nurse in the United States. And here she encountered a number of challenges and roadblocks along the way. So here, to explore the myriad documents that are related to Ruth's efforts to become a registered nurse, we are going to travel over to our archives, and we are going to again enter Ruth's name, and we are going to scroll down. And here we can look at, first of all, there are an array of letters here. You can see there are medical records that were necessary for her emigration. There are letters, there are diplomas, there are all kinds of the licensing that she had to go through, handwritten letters of recommendation written in Danish that talk about her work in one of the hospitals in Denmark. But here, actually, I want to click on a letter that came to her, advising her on the steps that she would need to take. This is from the Secretary of the State Board of Examiners of Nurses for New York. And here this letter offers her some details on what she is going to have to do in order to secure her license to practice nursing. So if you click on these images, you'll see it'll come right up and you will see a closer shot of the details. She received a number of letters like this, and she jumped through a number of bureaucratic hoops in order to eventually receive her nursing license, but she did, and she became a nurse yet again. This time she was working at the Presbyterian Hospital, Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York, working once again in an operating room. There, Ruth became very close friends with another young woman, a fellow to shower, and they eventually moved in and became roommates. And when Ruth asked one of her male friends to help them move in, that friend brought another friend, Manfred Rosenthal. And this is the day that Manny and Erica met and fell in love and were soon married. And Ruth served as the maid of honor at their wedding. Now, years passed and Ruth had a very full and rich life. But so the story goes, she liked to go skiing in Switzerland. And on one of these trips, she was invited to travel to Germany to visit friends. And on the way, she traveled through the hometown of her former love, Hans Knoop. Now, up until now, Ruth had never remarried. She'd never married. Forget remarried. She'd never married. And she was encouraged by a friend to look him up and see if she could find him. So the story goes, without spoiling it for you, we are going to click on their marriage certificate, which includes below in the description part of Ruth's recollections about how this came to be. And she says, as I was traveling on the train through Germany, I traveled through Mainz, Hans Knoop's hometown. When I told that to my friend, she convinced me to try to find and call him. After several attempts, I finally found him. His first question to me was to ask if I was traveling with my husband, and I told him no, I wasn't married. I then asked if he was married, and he said no. We had not seen each other in 24 years. We decided to meet. A year later, on February 3rd, 1967, we were married. Now the question was, where do we live? And here you can see their marriage certificate from February 3rd, 1967. And eventually they decided to stay in Germany, where they had a very full and happy life. And here we will go to our photos. Again, search Ruth Knoop. And let's see, there is actually a stunning photograph of Dr. Hans Knoop, whom she later married, her husband. Eventually, they decided to live in Germany. And there they enjoyed a very full and rich life together for 20 years. As Ruth put it, Hans and I had 20 wonderful years together. We traveled to Israel and the United States, hiked and skied, and enjoyed life with our dog, Dolly. Hans passed away in 1987, and 2 years later, Ruth returned to the United States and moved to Red Bank, New Jersey, in order to be close to her beloved friends, Erica and Manny Rosenthal, whom she considered her family, them and their extended family, their children and their grandchildren. She lived a very rich life and then began her extensive involvement volunteering with Chhange and speaking to students and members of the public. Ruth Knoop died on Friday, March 21st, 2008 in Tinton Falls, New Jersey. She was 85 years old, and thanks to the generous and wonderful contributions she gave to us of her archival items and the support of our community, we are able to now tell her story using this digital archives. So here today, we have offered you a tour of our digital archives, and we've also shared with you how this next innovative step in our educational trajectory and our educational resources can be harnessed in order to tell the rich and just inspiring story of Ruth Knoop and other survivors who contributed their resources. I want to mention that this is but one of our many resources that can be brought together in order to further fill out and tell the story of Ruth. We also have her story is featured in our Journeys Beyond Genocide exhibit housed at the center. But we also have a survivor suitcase and a scrapbook that is dedicated to Ruth's story and can be used to further fill out this picture. And then we also have recorded programs that have detailed the story of Ruth Knoop, one of which was delivered by our former executive director, Dale Daniels, to commemorate the November pogroms, also known as Kristallnacht, back in 2020, and that is on our YouTube channel. So together, this can become it's another resource to tell a very rich and full life story using a number of different options and primary sources that are available to our public. And so with that, I would like to thank you all for your kind attention, and I'd like to switch over to our live question and answer program. So for those of you who are joining us today, thank you so much. And now let's move on to your questions.